when you enter the public square, vote for justice as defined by the Noahic covenant. We could expand this point to everything you do in the public square. Lobbying, protests, lawsuits. I'm just going to isolate it on that question of voting, because I think probably the most common question Christians ask on the topic of politics is, well, which candidate should we vote for? Which ballot measures should we support? And what I'm saying is vote for justice as defined by the Noahic covenant. Can understand that, and we need to do a little biblical thinking here. What has God established governments to do in the Bible? What is their job? What is the power of the sword for? And when we think about that question, what's the job of government? Simply as Americans, before we go to Scripture, what we tend to default towards is certain American answers to those questions. We talk about three shared principles of the American experiment. We talk about rights, freedom, and equality. We say governments exist to provide for rights, freedom, and equality. And that's how we think about it. The trouble is, people mean very different things by those words, rights, freedom, and equality. How about the right to an abortion? How about the freedom to define one's own gender? How about marriage equality? Well, depending on your God or gods, you're going to say those are good or bad rights, views of rights, freedoms, and equality. In other words, there's something behind our views of rights, freedom, and equality, which then dictate whether or not we think those are acceptable. What's behind them? What's a view of justice? Everybody has a certain conception of justice, which animates, which determines whether or not we think that's a just set of rights, a just equality, a just set of liberties. Justice always comes first. Think about it. You'll never take away justice in order to accomplish freedom. But like prisoners or certain curfew moments, you might take away some freedom for the purposes of justice. Justice is primary. Rights, freedom, and equality are not. We're to pursue a just liberty, a just rights, a just equality. Right comes before rights. Pay attention to the S. Right comes before rights. Rights are not free floating after all. Something or someone has to make those rights right. And that's what government does. According to Paul in Romans 13, according to Peter in 1 Peter 2, reward the good, punish the bad. This is right, this is not right. That's a just set of rights. Those are not just rights. Governments exist within a limited jurisdiction to define what's right, what's just. I think we get this first and foremost in Genesis 9, 5, and 6. We'll come back to that in a second. We get it in Romans 13, I said, and I think it's confirmed in many other biblical texts. Think of 2 Samuel 8:15. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness to all his people. 1 Kings 3:28, Israel stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Or as the queen of Sheba, foreign queen, says to Solomon, because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king that you may execute justice and righteousness. 1 Kings 10. Or as Proverbs says in 29 verse 4, by justice a king builds up the land. How do we build up the land? From a government's perspective, by doing justice. Okay, so how do we define justice? What exactly is justice? Well, in the Bible, I'm not going to take the time to unpack this, to do justice, to make righteous judgments. I got a standard of righteousness. I'm called to make a judgment. I'm going to apply that standard of righteousness to that judgment I am called to make. That is what justice is in the Bible. And I think we first see this in Genesis 9:6, which says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for man was made in the image of God. When does God give coercive authority to governments? on earth. What is the original moment of authorization? It's right there. So as to keep the Cains from killing the Abels post-fall, post-flood, God says to Noah and all humanity after, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For, what's the foundation? What's the ground? For, man was made in the image of God. In other words, what's the standard of justice for governments? The standard of justice is whatever protects and upholds human dignity as defined by the fact that we are all God imagers. God intends all governments in all nations to establish this basic form of justice on their citizens, whether or not they acknowledge God. That is their job, and that is what they will be held accountable to do. It's the work of establishing and upholding justice and preserving the lives and the flourishing of God's imagers. Noahic justice is a preservative or protectionist justice. The dominion mandate to be fruitful and multiply, to be humanity going throughout the earth continues. But now God adds this, and he restates it in the first verses of chapter 9, Genesis 9. But now, as I said, to keep the Cains from killing the Abels, to make sure this crime doesn't continue to saturate and slow things down, he provides this coercive mechanism, this justice mechanism. And he states it in conjunction with his own promise not to destroy the world again in the flood. So I'm going to provide a platform of redemption for humanity to continue and for people come to a saving knowledge of me. So I'm going to put my bow of war down. The rainbow symbolizes that. And so that I don't destroy the earth, at the same time, I'm going to give governments to preserve the peace and order and preserve lives. So everything a government does, every law it makes, every court ruling it declares, every executive agency code it enforces, it should do for the purposes of protecting and affirming its citizens as God imagers. Its work of establishing or upholding justice must always be measured by the standard, the rule of the imago Dei, the image of God in all humanity, so that anything that harms or hurts or oppresses or exploits or hinders or tramples upon or degrades or threatens human beings as God's imagers arguably becomes the target of government opposition. And, by implication, anything that aids and abets and promotes or encourages a set of conditions that contributes to the ability of God imagers to live out their vocation, their job of being God imagers, should be considered a candidate for possible government encouragement. Punish the bad, reward the good, Paul says in Romans 13.